Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is John Blake. I am the Head of Education and Social Reform here at Policy Exchange, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening to this discussion of a Cambridge approach to improving education. This is our first event for the education unit since I joined Policy Exchange. Prior to that, I was a teacher, and I am struck by the fact I think this is possibly the first time I've spoken to an audience with a PowerPoint next to me who are not all children. So forgive me if I sort of click my fingers at you at various points if you start talking during the event. I'm delighted to welcome Tim Oates and John Jerrim here this evening. Tim is the Director of Assessment, Research and Development at Cambridge Assessment, and he's going to speak in a little while for about 25 minutes about the approach and what the lessons that Cambridge drawn from it. And then John, who is the Reader in Educational and Social Statistics at University College London, IOE, is going to respond. Both are eminently well qualified for those roles. Tim has advised government on curriculum over a number of years and been a leading figure in debates about international comparisons and the value and meaning of them. And John recently won the ERSC Early Careers Outstanding Impact Award and has just received an ERSC grant to study cross-national comparisons of educational attainment and social mobility. So I know both of them will have valuable and excellent things to say. But before they do, I'd like to abuse my position as host to hold forth on my own views. So I don't want to spoil the whole effect for you, but those of you who had the chance to read the report will have seen a fascinating and timely examination of the value and purpose of international comparisons in education. In one sense, we might ask why we bother to do it at all. Why should we care about what Finland do to their children? Should we not simply decide what we want to do with our own and make that work? And I think what's interesting in the Cambridge approach is that the answer is ultimately no, that we shouldn't be cherry picking. We shouldn't simply be going around the world and picking up on different things and desperately applying them. That we need to take seriously the historical contexts and the value systems of other international, other comparating jurisdictions, and think very carefully about our own before we implement it. And I think that's extraordinarily important. And perhaps, I think for me, the thing that shines through in this work is the value of ideas, not just shiny new policy ideas, but understanding the deep-rooted and often historically contingent, commonly held views of those engaged in the education system, children, parents, teachers, policymakers, all of us. And taking seriously the value of those ideas requires us to continue to engage in the free exchange and debate of those ideas, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening to do just that. If you wish to engage in the free debate of ideas on Twitter in the course of this, please do feel free. Our hashtags are hashtag Cambridge Approach and also our general PX Education hashtag, PX Education. And on that note from me, I'll now ask Tim to stand up and speak. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks very much for the opportunity to present at Policy Exchange. 25 minutes, goodness me, it's hot. It's the end of the day. I won't go for 25 minutes, but I will spend a bit of time drawing out some things from the document itself, but not patronising you. The document is there, it's not a long one. But also talk a bit about its genesis and talk a bit about method, because there's not much on method in terms of how the various categories and concepts were derived in this document. So I'll give a few insights into that. I also want to differentiate two things. So John has mentioned the importance of international comparison and the issue of system improvement. Now, I don't collapse those two things. I think that international comparison as an activity has escalated, and sometimes system improvement is only seen in terms of using the insights from international comparisons. I don't confuse those two things. What we've done is to look at the possibilities for and the means of really understanding systematic international comparison, and then thought hard about the literature and the processes and the practice of system improvement. And so throughout the document, I think you can see those two things as being separated. Now, Isabel Nisbet, who spent quite a lot of time in Singapore, and prior to that was the chief regulator in this country, and then prior to that was spent time in QCA, presented at the Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge and she reflected on her time in Asian settings. And she started with, I think, a brilliant set of categories. She said those who think about whether international comparisons are legitimate or not, there are some who say that you can learn everything from them, and clearly that's naive and highly problematic. There are others that say you can learn nothing from them, and that's equally naive and problematic. And what we need to do is to create policy learning out of it. And I think the nicest phrase to use is one which a number of us use, which is you can use the insights from transnational comparisons that have been done appropriately and analytically to hold a mirror up to your own context, to understand those things operating in your context to give you what you have got. Now, it's that last notion of holding a mirror up to your own system which drove many years ago the initial thinking behind developing a set of control factors. And I'll talk through those kind of issues for the next 3 or 4 minutes. So I think policy borrowing and cherry picking is naive. I've got many lists of things that have been attempted. The Training and Enterprise Councils were the result of a delegation that went to Philadelphia and saw the only private industry council that worked in America. And we decided to have those. We don't have them any longer. That's just one example of a long list of things which have been attempted. Individual initiatives which fail to take account of national context and national culture. So, policy borrowing and cherry picking we can quickly put on one side. Parallel description in international comparisons is extremely common. That's what happens in Finland. That's what happens in Singapore. So what? I mean, it's just a description of what happens. How on earth do you examine that description in order to make something of it? To make something of it for those embedded in those systems, and to make something of it for your own intentions to act. So, no good. And the next one is rather odd, paths to glory. What on earth does that mean? Well, really, and I'm going to criticise Michael Barber on this one. I don't know how a hoary old Marxist like Michael managed to convince the McKinsey organisation, which is highly liberal, to write the McKinsey report. Because when you pick it up, it's great. It has some very interesting parallels with our own work, particularly in respect of the idea that you have to understand the relationships and interrelationships within a system to understand and interpret its performance, not merely look at features of different aspects of the system. You have to look at their interaction, which is the note I'll finish on. So we agree absolutely about that. But then quickly the report becomes an ineluctable march towards great performance. And the paragraphs say, actually, we do recognise that these contexts are very different, but if you think hard about it, it says, they all basically did the same thing. So the question I would just put to anybody who feels that there is an ineluctable historical process which leads inevitably to high performance once you've started on a journey of improving your education system, just look at Finland, because its results are going down, and they're going down fast. And what they're doing now, to me, makes no sense at all in terms of what they did during the time that they improved. I mean, James Croft is here from CRMRE, and Gabriel Hellesaugren in Real Finnish Lessons. He and I agreed absolutely in respect of our joint analysis in that area, that you have to look at the historical record in relation to Finland to understand its performance. And I'll return to that on a couple of slides. So what we're really after is what the late David Rafe called policy learning, analytic insight. And that's why we've developed the frameworks and brought together the concepts in this document. There is, and John and I were talking about this, and there's high levels of policy traffic between nations, with people indeed trying to understand their own system from looking at others. By the way, I don't make the mistake that people within systems necessarily understand them in the most perfect way. I find it hilarious when academics are very critical of our own politicians, but criticise our own politicians on the basis of speeches made by politicians in other countries. And then we've got this curious phenomenon, ships passing in the night, of countries, just as one country abandons something, another country thinks that it's going to be the saving grace of its education system. And I like this. I like this concept of constructed anxiety, because I hear speech after speech after speech by politicians saying, the equivalent of the Russians are coming. You know, be very afraid because of what's happening in the Asian states. Therefore, listen to what I think we should do in our own country. In other words, on the basis of an international narrative, they construct a sense of paranoia and fear in their own setting to justify domestic behaviour. And that domestic action and behaviour may well not be grounded in secure transnational analysis, or indeed secure analysis of that country's position or challenges. But that is so frequent. Be very worried, the Russians are coming. And there's this whole problem of observation bias, which was very clear in respect of Finland. People went to Finland and asked the wrong question. They said, you know, have you got national tests? Have you got national inspection? To which the Finns very politely said, no, we haven't. The researchers didn't say, does the government actually specify the number of hours you should spend on particular subjects? Because if they had asked that question, then the Finns would have said, yes, that does occur in our country. And then perhaps the notion of an incredibly autonomous set of schools, free of any form of state restriction, might not have taken off in the way it did. The problem is, if you go and look solely through the spectacles that you're actually wearing and the issues that you're interested in, you will miss things. You'll miss deeper structures, and you will miss patterns of causation. So we're arguing entirely in tune with the McKinsey report that performance is more than the shape of single aspects of systems. And a very controversial but simple state of affairs is that around the world there are selective systems which are high performing, and there are comprehensive systems which are high performing. Yeah, what do you make of that? So we have to avoid this myopia of single models or single aspects of systems. And I do outline in the document that, in a sense, good research encourages us to look at individual things and their effect. And that's right. It's right that very, very concentrated academic research should drill down into the way in which things, individual aspects of systems, work. But unless we pull back and look at the interactions, we will be committing an error. And only recently I was asked by some journalists in Poland, the journalist said, what's the one thing you would change about the Polish education system? And so frequently we hear politicians say, well, we get pulled in and we get, what should we do about this thing? And the whole reason that we got this document is that we avoided that in England in relationship to the national curriculum. We looked at control factors and we looked at explanatory factors. When I was hauled into the department and asked to give an outline of what perhaps should be done to revise the national curriculum, the first slide I put up was the control factors as slightly refined now, the version here, but essentially what you've got in this document. And I said, then you can refine the national curriculum, but the extent to which it will be able to improve the outcomes in terms of attainment and equity and motivation in our schools will be contingent on its relationship with all the other factors operating in the system. Revision of the national curriculum, as hard, big and demanding and politically sensitive it is just a small part of factor one. And I think it was that the ministers and the officials were quite surprised by that. I think they expected a slide that actually should, the first slide to just say, this is what you need to do with the national curriculum. No, it said, this is the nature of a national curriculum in our system. And this is why it has to be revised in the light of an understanding of the other factors impacting on the system. Most obvious, accountability, but also teacher expertise, the organisation of schools, the nature of our qualifications, and so on. So you will find the framework of control factors. Now, what the document doesn't describe in a lot of detail is where the hell did these come from? Are these just some arbitrary thing put together in Cambridge? No, but they did come from quite an unusual source. So It would have been possible to, I think, derive them by a lot of empirical analysis, by going to an awful lot of countries and doing a great deal of observation. But that's not how they were derived. They were derived by scrutinising a huge body of international studies. David Rafe, Margaret Archer, Robin Alexander, Andy Green, and so on. And what I did was to analyse those studies, both in terms of the extent to which they comprise an effective and accurate and well-respected story of the development and the emergence of education systems, but I analysed them for the factors that they used in creating their descriptions and undertaking their analysis. And that in itself was fascinating, because a number of studies emerged with only really 3 factors being used to explain the performance of the system. Others, like Andy Green's and David Rafe's, came up with many, 20, 30. What we've done is to take them, categorise them, codify them, and then refine them into a system which is represented by this framework. You'll find they are explained in more detail, because it's always very difficult to produce short, succinct headings which accurately describe the content. And you'll also notice, as you read through it, hang on a minute, there's a bit of overlap between these. And surely, maybe that shouldn't be there. Yeah, that's going to be the case. But the idea is it's still an extremely powerful and helpful means of understanding the way in which systems behave and the way in which policy can be both criticised and formulated. So they are heuristics, and we make no further claim than that. We have used them. I mean, they've been around now for nearly a decade in Cambridge, and we have used them in development work as a means of validating them. And then we come on to explanatory factors, and some of you have heard me say this before, but it's a way of remembering it. And when I talked to the Finns about literacy, one of the things they said was, well, it's not surprising we've been good at reading for centuries, because the place is dark for half the year. Well, unless you introduce a youth curfew into England, you aren't going to have the same factor at play in your system. Now, it's a trivial example, but it rams it home. There are factors about which it's very difficult to have policy. Often they derive from history. Some of them you can have policy about, but they're quite tricky. And culture I'll finish on in just a moment. John picked out, I thought you were going to mention it, John, actually. John picked out something in the text when we were just discussing it. He said, goodness me, I agree with this paragraph. He said, that's what I feel about history. And you can say that, oh God, have we been brought here just to look at a list like that? And for Tim to say that you've got to bear in mind that these things relate, is that it? Surely that's unbelievably trivial as an observation. The reason it's a non-trivial observation is so frequently policy is formulated in the absence of a consideration of that. And so frequently the lack of a relationship between these things and contradictions, and that comes straight out of Bill Schmidt's work and Richard Parrott's work, contradictions between them explain problems in your education system. The fact that assessment pulls in a different direction to your national curriculum, or accountability leads to behaviours which are at odds with those that you're actually trying to promote in terms of equity and attainment. So, as obvious and as seemingly trivial as it is, it still explains an awful lot, and we think that's good science. The thing that John pulled out was quite a complex and dense sentence, which shows the kind of concepts we brought together. I said this highlights 2 essential observations, and this is the first of them. Firstly, that while contextual and contingent issues impinge on education, decisions and actions matter. There's no inevitability in educational development, no set pattern of improvement. And that goes straight back to what I was saying about the problems that I see in McKinsey's analysis. So to finish, we've got these explanatory factors. They interact when you are developing policy with those things about which you can have policy in the educational realm, or in ministries which are formulating policy which impinge on educational structures. And so the concepts of alignment and coherence are fundamental, and they do derive from Bill Schmidt's and Richard Parrott's empirical analysis on TIMS, where the highest performing systems manifest system coherence and alignment across those factors. Bill just asked a question. He said, is there anything that the high-performing systems have in common? And the thing which came out of the analysis was coherence and alignment across the factors, not a particular form of organisation or a particular form of schooling or a particular set of routes. The tricky concept and the tricky term which Bill used was to achieve alignment, you need curriculum control, which again appears in the McKinsey report in the journey from poor to fair. And curriculum control is analysed in Bill's seminal paper. And he says that the thing is that control need not come from the top. It can appear in systems in respect of self-disciplined alignment of the factors through democratic action at quite a devolved level. So it is not about top-down control, and it's not about a particular form of political organisation. So what we've got is simply an approach designed to support sound analysis. It's not a substitute for detailed and sensitive analysis of specific national settings. It's designed to support that. It's designed to help structure that. And it doesn't supply judgment-free solutions. What I've tried to emphasise is it supports small-scale action as well as grand reform. So although the list of control factors is sprawling and grand, what it highlights is if you want to do one small thing, it will probably only be successful if you take all those things into account. So it does apply to small-scale reform as well as grand reform, small-scale action as well as grand reform. You'll see there's analysis of complexity. We differentiate complex systems from complicated systems. And we've used the literature on complexity to draw out something very important and link it, if you're interested, to critical realism in explaining the performance of social systems. The problem with social systems is that the ideas change how the systems behave. And that makes them complex systems, not just complicated systems. The ideas in an education system about ability actually affect the way in which the system behaves. We've also introduced this idea of resilience. You can think of it as an escape trajectory, which is that if you want to send something into orbit, it's got to have enough energy to actually escape the gravitational pull of the Earth. A lot of initiatives are not like that. And formative assessment in Medway and Oxford, Black and Williams, which did not yield the kind of improvement in educational attainment in the kids, which was expected through the big transnational study, because they concluded, because of the weight of accountability. And removal of levels, very interesting. A school recently said to me, we've got rid of levels by introducing a new 10-level framework. The thing is, things have to escape the gravitational pull of the existing. Educational systems are resilient. You can change them, but they snap back in or crawl back into position so easily. And again, if you don't attend to all of the control factors in relationship to educational policy, this resilience can be so great that you can spend billions of dollars and see it all for naught after 4 or 5 years. We have said that we've listened very much to what Lucy Crehan is saying. Culture can be an object of policy. My goodness me, schools are like small little states. They've got their own rules. The classroom has its own culture. The school has its ethos. That's a place where you can determine what the culture is. So to say, it's impossible because the culture is different. And the importance of ideas. Now, that's not a trivial observation. It's based on good social theory, which explains why social systems are not like natural systems. They don't have laws, they only have tendencies. I thought you'd like this, so we just put it up. This is a brilliant analysis by Frank Achtenhagen, and it talks about the cycle of planned failure. There's a problem, it's not fully analysed, the solution is produced in the light of only partial analysis, but as it's a social system, you act, that changes the system, And that gives you more problems that you can barely even begin to describe. And so round and round do we go. We do think there's hope, though. You can get out of it, and we describe what you need to do. And analysis plays a very, very big role in this, as well as the insights from transnational comparative analysis. It's been developed over a decade of analysis and action. It's been put into place with people, with politicians, with policymakers, with civil servants. It's been used in a number of settings around the world, and I hope the case studies provide an interesting application. The three final observations are these, and they are short, John. You need to pay attention to the shape of specifics, whether you should have GCSEs or not, whether the system is selective or not, whether early reading schemes should be in place because parents aren't able to support their kids in the way in which they might do. You need to pay attention to all those specifics. But in addition, you need to pay attention to the relationships and interrelationship. And you also need to pay attention to the movements, if you're a policymaker or a civil servant, in the movement of those things around which impinge on the education system. In Germany, the tax system kept women at home since 1945, but it began to be an issue in their system. So taxation policy was very relevant. Somebody went to Singapore recently and said, "Oh, it's very interesting. They don't have any policy on the mix of different ethnicities in the schools. There's no school policy on racial mix." Yeah, that's because there's a policy actually of enforcing racial mix in the housing around the schools. The researcher had missed that. So constant awareness, constant analysis, but because of the nature of systems, constant fine-tuning in the light of the interactions. I suppose one personal observation, which is not in the book, is that in the text, is that systems change and improve slowly, but they get bad really, really quickly. And all of the recommendations around analysis and fine-tuning, I hope, lead to something which we see occasionally, that really policy action in education is best when you can time travel. Because if you can go back 10 years to the point where the thing you wanted to stop happening started happening, then the education system would be a lot better. Sometimes you have to act on things that have already become structurally problematic before they're actually recognised. And what we hope is that the control factors will give a framework to policymakers and to analysts and to civil servants to enable better and more rapid analysis and recognition of those kind of problematic occurrences in systems and give rise to more sophisticated and appropriate policy responses. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think everyone enormously enjoyed that. I think the point about resilience is one that very much struck me, and I thought of. I bought my eldest son for Christmas a bowl of non-Newtonian fluid, and you could shape it into whatever figure that you liked, but after about half an hour it always turned back into a kind of gooey mess. And I think that is a reminder of the fact that it takes an enormous amount of energy and will to change a system, but it takes a corresponding amount actually to maintain a system in a stable position. And I think the lessons of the complex interaction of socioeconomic factors with ideas and individuals is really important, and I've therefore taken out of that a youth curfew will massively improve literacy, and we'll be recommending that forthwith. I'd now like to ask John Jerrim for you to come up and respond to Tim's talk and to get us started a little bit on the questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you a lot for that, John, and thank you a lot, Tim. I thought I've heard every policy recommendation ever going from PISA and Tim's, but I've got a new one, time travel. It's absolutely amazing, Tim, that you come up with that as a kind of policy recommendation to fix our education system. But what your kind of report and presentation made me reflect upon a bit was kind of the international assessment data. We all kind of get a little bit obsessed about it when things like PISA, PIRLS, TIMSS, those international rankings come out. Those countries are at the top. What are they doing that's kind of so good, and why are we so far behind? And my first reflection on kind of your report and presentation was this: just how many factors you managed to come up with that can potentially explain differences between countries. We've got 14 control factors here, another another six explanatory factors. And you think about all these things differ across countries. So it kind of reiterates, I think, one of the points you were making. However, how are you ever going to pin down, this is what Singapore, this is what Finland's doing to make such a great success, and therefore we should borrow from it? You can't use the data in that way. And I think that's a really important lesson to remember next time you sit at one of Andreas's presentations and you see a hypnotic scatter plot saying, look, all the high performers do this. Just think to yourself, there's so much else going on. I've got another version of one of those scatter plots that Andreas uses so much, and it actually shows all the high-performing countries tend to eat a lot of ice cream. Now, there's a policy and response children can get down with. So just bear that in mind. Okay, the second reflection that it kind of brought to me was, one thing I get asked a lot about these international assessments is, okay, so how might we use them? And I think actually Tim started getting the ball rolling on that a little bit, particularly at the end of the report when they talk about case studies. And I think case studies is kind of part of the cycle that needs to happen when using these types of data. Understanding what's going on in the country and its historical context is really, really important. So I think those case studies in combination with data like PISA and TIMSS can help us potentially start developing ideas. So we can think about ideas generated from another country. I'm not then saying we should take that idea, cherry pick it, and bring it over here. What I think the next step is, we should think about how to adapt that idea that it might suit our context. After that, we want to go out and trial it. Let's go and do an EEF trial, right? Let's evaluate it, see if it will actually work in this context. And if we do see some kind of sign of promise, maybe then we evaluate it and roll it out as we go. So that's how I think we use these international data as a starting point to start asking some interesting questions, developing some initial ideas, but then going through in the kind of research and analytic process before rolling out. And the final thing that it also made me reflect upon, and this is another key point, that change really does take time. None of these things are kind of particularly easy to move, and their impacts are not immediate. When you look at kind of the OECD PISA study, now we're going for 15 years, actually, the OECD average, the average industrialized country, the performance has not improved. It stayed almost stable. And actually, improvement is the exception rather than the rule. You can see that over a 15-year period, and even if you go back to international studies 50 years ago, there's a remarkable stability over time in how countries are doing. So I think that's a really other kind of valuable lesson. Don't expect things to happen quickly. They take a long time to kind of feed through. So they're my three reflections, and I think at this point it's over to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, John. That's incredibly useful, so thank you. And so, yes, it's now time for any questions that people have. If we have a microphone, I think, somewhere, so if I can ask, if you have a question, if you put your hand up and I choose you, and then if you can just say your name and which organisation you are from, and we'll try and take them in the traditional batches of 3. So you can start, lady here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Celia Hoyles. I'm at Institute of Education, University College London. I was really interested in all of the factors and I love the framework, but I have become obsessed of late about areas in this country, England, that have traditional under-attainment, despite all, the same national curriculum, the same sort of policy initiatives. And I'm particularly interested, and I know John has actually done a paper quite recently about this, about how London, now those of us who've been around a little while know that London used to be really low achieving, low attaining, and the last thing that middle class parents did was send children to London schools, and Charles Clarke here knows this. And now there is this London effect, that you actually, if you do an EEF study, you mustn't have too many schools in London because they outperform other areas. So I have become obsessed recently in trying to think about those areas of England that have the same national curriculum, the same policy framework, the same, I don't know whether they're the same values, I'm not sure, but they have, despite all these initiatives and very positive steps forward, continue to be under-attaining. And I would really like to see how we might move forward. Now, London Challenge, and London now is doing well. And I'm not saying it's one factor, it's a huge number of interacting factors, without doubt.
Yeah.
But what can we do about these other areas in England, the same country, and yet they continually do not achieve what they should do in education? And I don't know whether your framework or your ideas would help me there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This gentleman here.
Thanks, Chris Waterman. Hello, Tim. I'm now based in the House of Lords, and certainly I'm going to rush back with the diagram on page 10, because it seems to sum up Brexit perfectly.
It's done by a German. So.
Yeah. Several questions for Tim. Does size matter, in the sense that what you've chosen is 3 countries which together add up to less than a third of England?
Yep.
Secondly, you talk on page 10 about there is no single aspect of an innovation which will achieve a perfect system. I think there is no such thing as a perfect system.
That's the point.
And I think it's really unhelpful to imply that even if you have 10 factors, you'll end up with a perfect system. And certainly, I'm delighted that you're against cherry picking, because I think that Michael Gove's obsession with Swedish models for a short time was unhelpful. And I actually heard Andreas yesterday with one of his flowcharts and his scattergrams. In fact, he has lots of them. I don't know if you know, but he gets commission from PowerPoint. Anyway, but he came up with the notion that Japan, the contact ratio is about 35%, which is one of the lowest if you exclude Turkey. England is the highest at about 70% if you exclude Colombia. And I don't think either of those exclusions, would alter the picture much. So how can we learn? And finally, on a score of 0 to 10, where do you think England scores on using evidence to implement policy over the past 7 years?
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Yep, just back there.
Harry Fletcherwood, Institute for Teaching. You highlight in your England case study fragmentation of the system and the use of assessment and accountability as pretty much the main control factor. Where would you see productive, positive curriculum control coming from within the English system, apart from assessment and accountability?
Okay, thank you very much. So if we start with Tim, and then John, if you want to add anything in.
Sure, thank you very much indeed. Celia, thank you. Yeah, I mean, yes, all the claims that began to emerge around the London effect, fascinating, and so many competing explanations for it being the case. I was at the RSA and there was a very interesting account where somebody said, everything was wrong about ILIA, but everything was right about the London Challenge. It's a very odd thing to say, because in a sense, the London Challenge replicated the systems of control and organisation which ILIA had. So that's quite interesting. I think there is something around a constant flow of information from the schools to the centre and back, and very targeted allocation of funding and action, which seemed to differentiate London Challenge as a period of activity from what went before, and it drives us. I mean, obviously we could talk for a very, very long time about this, but it drives us really to what I think is critical, which is what happens in the classroom. The interactions that occur in the classroom, and they did change. Paul Peterson's fascinating. I mean, his analysis of charter schools in America. He's now begun to look at why we've got in the States we have rapidly declining charter schools and rapidly improving charter schools. And I'm afraid the explanation is not to do with structural reform and not to do with the amount of funding. It is to do with what they're doing in the classroom and the nature of those institutions. And for me as a researcher, having gone through so many of the reports in the same way in which you have, my money's on that. It's that which has changed pedagogic and didactic practice. And you said, well, what about other regions? You know, because they've all got a national curriculum. No, they haven't. And the national curriculum, you know, is called a curriculum, but it's actually a relatively weak framework of standards, extremely weak in the context of academies. So I do favour actually having a system which communicates very strongly a set of well evidenced expectations in the form of a framework of standards. So I mean, I do think that the fact that the national curriculum is not a national curriculum is problematic. John, do you want to respond to that first question first, rather than me going through all of them?
Yeah, the only particular thought I had on that was kind of Simon Burgess's work recently, where he's kind of argued, I understand that a lot of it is actually about the different kind of demographic composition of London, or at least that does explain a large portion of it. So I don't think it gets rid of everything. I still think there's a London effect, but I don't. I think it's more muted than a lot of people initially anticipate, and I think it's more concentrated from memory in the lower socioeconomic groups in particular.
Yes.
So I think it's one of those kind of research findings where it's kind of a little bit of Chinese whispers now, where kind of people are kind of getting a little bit confused about what the evidence actually does show, including potentially me. But I think it's one of those things where, you know, we need to go back and actually drill down a little bit more. So that's the only thing I'd say on that kind of the London question.
Yeah. Chris, you had three, and the first was size. I don't think I'm breaking confidentialities by saying that to Michael Gove, when we first started talking about national curriculum, I said, look, the easiest way to improve the education system is just reduce the population of England to about 7 million. Because, you know, Hong Kong, Singapore, Alberta, Massachusetts. The one that bucks the trend, of course, in that, when we have an equivalent size, is South Korea. But there are, as you know, there are enormous issues of stress and pressure on young children, and a very, very different learning identity, actually, amongst those children. So, yeah, I think size does matter enormously, and it matters how you communicate. The head of the inspection service in Scotland once said, if I'm fed up with what the principals in FE colleges are doing to Scotland, I put them in one room and tell them off. You know, you can do things that you can't do in a big system, and you communicate and gain consensus and control, curriculum control, in very, very different ways. So size absolutely matters.
So why did you choose three such small ones?
I think because they what we didn't offer those in terms of the sole set of countries from which you can gain policy learning, or that you need to look at. They're included because I've done most work on those, and we wanted to exemplify the application of the control factors. I felt confident about the nature of a short description. I mean, of course, we validated them with researchers in the countries concerned, but that was the reason. Interestingly, damn, that was what I meant in that sentence, that there's no such thing as a perfect system.
What it says.
Yeah, I think I need to look at the drafting of that. Because the idea is that you can't attain perfection. You constantly have to nurture, you constantly have to watch, you constantly have to analyse, and it can go wrong very quickly if you don't do that, is what I'm saying. So, oh dear, I'll have to look at that. Yes, in terms of evidence-based, using evidence to implement policy, actually I'm really impressed by the extent to which politicians have, I mean, I've worked with politicians for many, many, many years, and so this sounds a bit pompous. I don't think I'm, somehow better than politicians by virtue of being a researcher, because my goodness, they have to take a lot into account in representing the country and making sure that they take the right actions. But over that period of time, I've seen them use evidence in a much more sophisticated way, and be far more attuned to doing the right thing on the basis of what the evidence says. I mean, that makes it really incumbent on researchers to not to be irresponsible in what they offer or how they represent it. And goodness only knows I've seen that happen. But my experience is that for all the complaints, for all the rhetoric, for all the statements, I've just seen an exponential increase in the use of evidence in policy formation in this country. Okay, and John, I mean, what's your perception?
Yeah, I can chip in on a couple of points there. I can give you some more examples of big countries. Japan's, pretty big by population size. It does pretty well. And dare I say, within certain disciplines, England. England doesn't do too badly in science, and we're quite a big country.
Yep.
So, there are kind of some other examples of big countries out there. And the other point about research use, I can only talk, anecdotally from a conversation I had with someone at the OECD who's been doing a lot of work around evidence use in education. Not only with kind of politicians, but with kind of the system as a whole, teachers, whatever. And I think we're often feel fairly down about it, that we don't use evidence as much. And she's actually said, you know what? England's one of the better countries out there. There's actually more research evidence interest in use here than elsewhere. So,
yep.
And I trust her view, because you often can't take a rational own view of your own country in some ways. And having an international organisation that has been able to look across countries like that thing, I found that kind of really informative. So I think often we kind of are a little bit too negative on that point, and I think it's actually better than we might think.
In Andy Green's book, Education and State Formation, now out in 3 years of a second edition, is superb on that. And big countries that improved at the time that modern education emerged, Germany, France and England, extraordinary. But our problem is that our performance is stuck and therefore moribund. And that is the problem that we face, particularly in terms of equity. Fragmentation and assessment accountability being used as the principal policy mechanisms. Well, of course, the department is discussing other control factors at the moment. Funding, fair funding formula. It did for a while discuss buildings, building schools for the future, and so on and so on. But yes, qualifications, assessment, accountability carry a huge load. So many policy objectives are, if you look at, well, what is the mechanism by which they will be discharged? Qualifications, assessment, and accountability. And that's tough. I really do think that in terms of influencing what we know needs to be influenced by the exchange of good practice between institutions, through, in Shanghai, they carefully extract the best lessons and make sure that they're available to all schools. How we influence that thing which happens in the classroom, minute by minute, under the control of professionals. Assessment and accountability are often quite remote instruments to try to do that. So I think we've got to look at the list of control factors and think about how all our aims, which are very laudable, are discharged through specific policy instruments. I mean, a plug for Policy Exchange is, Jonathan, Gary and I wrote Nice Aims, Shames, the Law's a Mess. Because in essence, the curriculum aims are unbelievably laudable. They're all about equity, they're all about high attainment, they're all about preparation for a new and vibrant economy. But the legal instruments need to be aligned with those aims, and the policy instruments need to be informed by the full list of things which are possible under the control factors.
Thank you very much. I think on the London Challenge point, I'll just point out that Labour's recent election manifesto pinned quite a lot of their educational improvement offer on sharing the lessons of London Challenge. So presumably if we ping them an email, they will know how it worked. Any further questions?
Chris Belk, Conservative Transport Group. Chris Belk, Conservative Transport Group. I'm concerned about the fact that we're in the midst or at the beginning of and accelerating all the time what's called the digital revolution, the second industrial revolution, the question of rapid automation of jobs which are taking place ever faster all the time. All our children are going to wake up at the end of their education in a completely different world, which at the present moment We know it's going to change a lot, but it's totally unpredictable. How do we deal with that?
Anyone else? Lady in the middle there.
I'm Jana from Brintelli Knowledge Transfer. Do you find there is such a thing called internal motivation versus external motivation in students? And if so, would it be fair to say that classrooms which have more self-motivated students perform better?
Okay, and one final question, anyone else? Gentleman there.
Hello, I'm Abhik Sen. I'm the head of policy and research in the social development side of the Commonwealth Secretariat. So my work essentially involves helping many of our member governments devise better evidence-based policies, and most of them are low-income or middle-income countries, far removed from the PISA and TIMS processes. So the question I have for you is, which elements of the Cambridge approach do you think would be most applicable to these sort of countries in terms of their utility to the education sector there? And which of the elements of the Cambridge approach would perhaps be least applicable in those situations? Thank you.
Tim, do you want to start off again?
Yes, I will. Thank you very much indeed. Goodness, Chris. Okay. Well, you know, all the futurologists stand up and say, it's about creativity, it's about innovation, it's about 21st century skills. On our website, Arenka Suto has done a very good analysis of 21st century skills, and it turns out that quite a lot of them are neither. It's also interesting when we think, well, you know, of course, it's all been gradual change until now, well, apart from the various agricultural revolutions, massive movements and urbanisation, the Industrial Revolution. And when we look back historically, actually, there are a whole series of things in general education which we think are pretty important. Critical thinking is often seen as a 21st century skill. Go back to Matthew Arnold, go back to what it was that they were saying that should be present in the primary school curriculum. It's critical thinking. I do worry about some losses on the basis of what 21st century skills are like and what the economy of the future needs. So I go into some primary schools, and this is based on visits and observations. It's not been subject to a research project out of Cambridge. But the teachers say, yes, we know that children will not be writing in future. They'll be producing all their text online, using keyboards. And so we are easing up a bit on handwriting. And when you look at the kids' workbooks, that's absolutely true, both in terms of legibility, volume, and the nature of language. Well, we know from research that if kids are not achieving complex language by the age of 7, they will be in deep trouble cognitively. We also know that speed of reading is correlated with academic attainment, and always has been, Caroline Rose's work. And so if you're taking things away and assuming they're just going to occur through digital processes, through some kind of osmosis, then I think our young people are going to be in trouble. They will need to understand the fundamentals of disciplines. We know that there's still very high wage return to mathematics, to the fundamentals of science. And employers may talk, and Bennett and I talk about this all the time. Bennett and I agree that employers may say that all they want is creativity, innovation, interpersonal skills. Look at what they pay for. Look at the wage return analysis. Look at wage differentials. Because those constantly reinforce that they do indeed want people who are proactive, who are innovative, as well as absolutely nailing the fundamentals of established and evolving disciplines, such as biochemistry. So that's my response there. In terms of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, they're real. I mean, they're good in the psychological literature. They continue to differentiate behavior of animals and human beings. It all depends on circumstances as to which is better. I must say that we don't lack extrinsic motivation in the form of wages, performance-related pay, and all those other things. And so I think that all of our social, economic and academic systems should have elements of both. And I certainly know that over time, individuals will vary as to which is most appropriate for them depending on their own individual circumstances. So again, like the control factors, it's a question of understanding what intrinsic motivation consists of and understanding what extrinsic motivation consists of, and fine-tuning them for each and every individual circumstance. We still get many kids, by the way, who select subjects in schools. They select the subject which they are less interested in, but because they know that the teacher is a good teacher. And that's very interesting in terms of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, in terms of the choices of relatively young children. Endlessly fascinating. John?
Yeah, I'm going to just return quickly to the previous point of kind of about what do we do about kind of the future. And I think I agree in many respects that there's always going to be those core skills that aren't going to go out of fashion. Your maths, you're being able to write, you're being able to stand up and be able to talk in front of people. You're always going to need that over kind of the future of time. I don't think that's going to go away. But I also think that there's potentially a role for kind of lifelong learning as well, and the need to be able to adapt and update skills as we're going forward. And perhaps we think too much in some ways of education finishing 18, 21 when you leave school or university, whereas, you know, it's trying to look into the future, but actually having more lifelong learning to update skills, particularly for certain groups, is going to become more and more important.
Okay, and finally, which of the elements? Well, I mean, I suppose the whole thesis is that a developing nation should actually examine what it, first of all, of course, establish aims in relationship to its education system. You can't do policy formation and have sensible action unless you've formulated some sense of purpose and aims. And attention needs to be paid to that. And then once there is some clarity around that, and it's clear that in Finland's period of improvement, from a very, very, in terms of European nations, a very low base, the formation of a commonly held set of beliefs about education, about what it can achieve in terms of economy, and ideas about children and about the rights of all children to a high-quality education. The fact that those aims were articulated clearly was itself a policy instrument and was absolutely fundamental to the sustained improvement in the Finnish context. So formulation of aims, then an examination of the shape of the system in relationship to the control factors, and then the formulation of policy to discharge them. No, there aren't. When you look through them, they're pretty agnostic as to whether you're an emerging nation or a developed nation. And we hope that they are a helpful heuristic. Again, not providing any judgment-free solutions as to what to do. My anxiety about quite a few transnational comparisons which try to draw lessons do become pretty authoritarian as to what you should do. The autonomy argument was all about that. I mean, loads of nations said, we've been told that we should make our schools more autonomous. And frankly, often in a state of development or a period of development where that just looks like a really bad idea. So we step back from formulating those kind of recommendations. This is a means by which actions can be formulated in a particular context, paying full attention to what is occurring in that context. That may seem like a pretty low aspiration, but we think it's desperately needed because of the way in which policy formation often occurs in a very partial way or informed by these relatively naive recommendations from the transnational comparisons.
We are at time. John, did you have any very quick responses to that?
No.
Okay, all right. Well, I'd like to extend our thanks to Tim and to John for their time and their words this evening, and also thank all of you for coming, and I hope to see you at PX events in the future. I'm going home to try not to dwell too much on the fact that my subject was always the least popular humanities option when I was a teacher. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks.